Hi, welcome to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the film series with lively discussion. I'm your host, Jerry Carlson, and I teach cinema studies at the College of Staten Island of the City University of New York. Today we continue our 10-film survey of the last 25 years of Latin American film. We'll be seeing the first of the 2 Brazilian films we'll see in this series. Today that film is Macunaima, a wild, outrageous, allegorical, strictly anti-realistic comedy based upon a famous Brazilian novel. This film calls for the imagination of Monty Python, not for any other kind of comedy. We'll be discussing that and a variety of other things after today's screening with 2 guests. Today we have Professor Robert Stam of New York University and Professor Zé Gatti of the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. Enjoy the outrageous Macunaima. Okay, well, are we... Oh, well, hi! Welcome back to Cinema Then, Cinema Now. I hope you enjoyed Macunaima, a wild film, an extraordinary film, a film that certainly deserves some discussion. But before we get on to the discussion, I'd like to take these few moments to introduce today's 2 guests. Sitting to my left is Professor Robert Stam of New York University, who's in the Cinema Studies program there. Bob is a very well-known expert on the Brazilian cinema and is in fact one of the co-authors and co-editors of the collection anthology Brazilian Cinema issued by the University of Texas Press. He's also the author of A Reflexivity in Literature and Film, which has a ripe section of a chapter on Macunaima in it. And in 1989, he will also be publishing Subversive Pleasures, Bakhtin, Cultural Studies, and Film. Over to my right is Professor Zé Gatti. Zé teaches at the University of Santa Catarina in Brazil. In their media studies program, where he teaches film history, film aesthetics, and in fact video production. He's the author of a book published in Brazil on Globo Rocha, the distinguished Brazilian director, and he's in the United States at this time pursuing his doctorate in cinema at NYU. Zé, as one of our 2 resident Brazilian experts, but as our resident Brazilian of the show. This film we've just seen comes out in 1969. It's at the end of the 60s itself. The 60s were what kind of period in Brazilian cinema itself?
Well, this film also marks a transition from the Cinema Novo movement, which dominated, the film scene in Brazil during the 60s.
Okay.
The most important films of that period were produced under the aegis of the Cinema Novo movement. Like
let's name just a couple of those films.
Globo Rocha made Black God, White Devil, and Nelson Pereira dos Santos directed Barren Lives, and other films which were they were praised in international festivals in Europe, in the United States, and so forth. So Macunaima, it breaks with the tradition of so-called serious films of Cinema Novo, which were more. They treated issues, social issues, problems of Brazilian society in a very serious kind of tone. And Macunaima, draws from comedy, all its force, all its strength.
Okay, so I was just thinking that one of the models for cinema novo before Macunaima was it clearly neorealism and the way in which it was really in touch with the social and historical realities.
Yeah, we could say that Italian neorealism and the French Nouvelle Vague were the main influences in cinema novo. Even though cinema novo had its own aesthetics, its own forms of narrative, but the main influences acknowledged by the directors were these two movements.
An interesting point about Macunaima is that it renews contact with a very Brazilian pre-existing genre, which the first cinema novo directors were very critical of, and that was the chanchada. And these were comical, usually musical films from the 30s, 40s, and 50s. Carmen Miranda, for example, got her start in the chanchadas. Now, the major black actor in Macunaima, Grande Othello, or Big Othello, was someone who became known as an actor in the chanchadas. He was also the featured actor in the Orson Welles film, It's All True, which was shot but never actually completed in Brazil in 1942. And he's participated in all phases of Brazilian cinema, from cinema novo to the avant-garde. But by choosing him as an actor, I think that was one of the secrets to the film's commercial success, that he was such a popular actor. He was known as the king of the chanchadas. And it renewed contact with a popular audience, which Cinema Novo hadn't really managed to make contact with.
Had Cinema Novo been shown, because the question of venue, where films get shown, is very important. Was Cinema Novo shown in commercial venues, normal movie houses, or was it a mixed, cinema clubs, or what's?
It was a mixed. Zay can perhaps address this more than I can, but they were screened commercially. They were screened in Cinematheques, but there was a lot of frustration on the part of Cinema Novo that they didn't get access to all the popular audiences that they wanted. So much of their audience was kind of middle-class student audience.
Yeah.
But I'm sure Zay has
Among
more.
the big problems with cinema in Brazil till today is that exhibition and distribution are in the hands of multinational corporations. And this is a big problem, because Brazilian directors cannot show, filmmakers, they cannot show their work in their own country. And that's one of the plagues with Cinema Novo. But what happens is that also Cinema Novo films were sometimes too sophisticated for the audience, or maybe they didn't choose the right way to address the audience, They were too worried about the things that they wanted to say, but sometimes they forgot how to get contact, with the audience. And Macunaima also breaks that tradition, because even though Joaquim Pedro de Andrade, who is Macunaima's author, the filmmaker, and he was very much connected to the Cinema Novo movement, but Macunaima is the first big box office hit in Brazil, and so Cinema Novo can be a success too. That's what people said in 1969.
Well, it's also...
Even though it must be so weird for American audiences, because it's such a local, regional, film. It's so related to Brazilian.
Well, but there's a way in which I don't think this film comes out of a tradition that's a mainstream tradition to us. This kind of comedy, this kind of thing. But I think we have some touchstones on it. I mean, I mentioned in the introduction something like Monty Python, the non-sequential nature, episodic nature of that, and if you don't know very much about the United Kingdom, Monty Python is just crazy and very amusing. Yes. But then the more you know about the culture of Great Britain, then the more precise the strategies, the social criticism, the inversions of types, etc. comes. And I suspect that's the case as one gets to know, well, as you do know, the specific cultural context of Macunaima. Zay or Bob, we'll let you both take this. What are some of the things that might be difficult for an audience to understand about this film that are culturally, specific and that we might not be familiar with?
I think it's one of the most culturally coded films ever made, starting even with the credits, the fact that you see a backdrop that looks vaguely Amazonian. The colors are green and yellow, the colors of the Brazilian flag. Later, Macunaima, he wants to get a scholarship to Europe as an artist to go pursue the people eater.
Right.
He dresses up in green and yellow patriotically in order to get a government scholarship. There are many kind of verbal jokes. Much of the film is spoken in kind of nursery rhymes. It would be something like different strokes for different folks, kind of Muhammad Ali style rhymes. For instance, if you remember, Macunaima comes back to the teepee and he says to his mother, "Mother, I dreamed a tooth fell out." And she says, "Then a relative will die," and then she proceeds to die. It's a bit like step on a crack, break your mother's back, as if in a film suddenly the back would be broken. So kind of literalizing these proverbs. I'll just give one more example. I'm sure Zay will have many others. At one point, Macunaima is in the hammock with Susie, and obviously there's some sort of sexual activity going on. Gigue, who is Susie's boyfriend supposedly, is outside the door, and he says, "I have a pain in my elbow." Well, there's an expression in Portuguese that when you have pain in the elbow, it means you're being cuckolded, which is precisely what's happening at that moment in the film.
But not only popular imageries like that, but also there is a the film itself. It deals with images that we learn at school in Brazil. For instance, how the Indians live, how and it's all made fun of all the time. So not made fun of the Indians, but made fun of the film makes fun of the images of the Indians that we are supposed to have learned at school, And the same is with racism, how the film deals with racism. Some people, out of Brazil, they take that scene in which Macunaima is black, and he gets sprinkled by that water, and he turns into a white Prince Charming, and they say, well, that's racist because the whites are valued as superior to blacks, and that's a parody. It's making fun of racism.
In fact, the music you hear during that sequence, I don't know if you recognized it, is from Footlight Parade. The Busby Berkeley Lloyd Bacon.
It had, I knew it was an American show tune, but I didn't know.
It's By a Waterfall, Sob uma Cascata. So it's a kind of tacky camp version. And if you remember Footlight Parade, the James Cagney character is inspired by the sight of black children in Harlem playing in the water of a hydrant to have a scene of many whites, and what could be more white than a Busby Berkeley musical? So there's a whole kind of joke on this valorization of whiteness. And it's important to note that the author of the source novel was himself mulatto and was very conscious of Afro-Brazilian culture. And you have many Afro-Brazilian references in the film, such as the Macumba, where Macunaima uses Afro-Brazilian religion to get his vengeance on, you remember when he's kicking
the bourgeois giant.
Right, exactly.
Now, that brings us to the fact that this is a literary adaptation. I mean, the film, when we're watching it, I think, seems extremely filmic. I mean, the stunts, the way everything is staged. So, I mean, one can't imagine this as a stodgy novel. It must be a wild thing in itself.
Right. Maybe I should say a few words about the source novel. It's a novel written in 1928 by a modernist Brazilian writer, influenced by very diverse sources from the Indian Romantic movement in Brazil, by Surrealism. He includes some Surrealists in the books, and he calls them macumbeiros, in other words, practitioners of the Afro-Brazilian religion. So he makes a link to this kind of European avant-garde valorization of what they called sauvagerie, but saying, no, here in Brazil, this is part of our culture. So there's kind of a reversal. The title, it's interesting that it's an Indian name, which means the great evil. This is not a name. You don't meet Macunaimas. You meet Carlos, Pedro, but on the street you do not meet Macunaima. The subtitle is the hero without any character. And now this is true in a double sense, because he has no character ethically. Sometimes he's courageous, sometimes he's noble, sometimes he's the opposite, because he's a summa of Brazil. So he has no consistency. The author said his consistency is not having consistency. Why? Because he's a synthesis of everything that's Brazilian. Now this cover, the Brazilian version, you see that he's black, he's white, and he's indigenous. And there too, he's an ethnic synthesis. And the opening sequence of his birth, first of all, it's Indian names. The manner of giving birth is Indian, using gravity to help in the childbirth. Gigue has African robes, a reference to the African ancestry. Manape, he's kind of religious and moral, has kind of a cape that is vaguely religious. The hut is kind of indigenous, but also kind of backwoods kind of hut. So there you get a total synthesis of Brazilian ethnicity and this kind of fusion with all its problems but which makes up Brazil. It's kind of a parodic version of the Brazilian family.
Okay, and all of that, I mean, this is a translation of something, all of which is in this novel.
Right. Well, it's important to say the novel in 1928 was based on a collection by a German anthropologist of legends from the Amazon. Now, what the director did is he updated. In fact, he went back to the original legends and even added some items which were not used in the novel. And just to give one example of the updating, for instance, in the novel, there was a character, C, the imperatrice, empress of the Amazon.
Okay.
She becomes an urban gorilla in the film.
Okay.
Exactly.
Okay.
Because
an issue of 1969.
Right.
it was a year after the coup d'etat, and the left, because there was very severe repression, started robbing banks to finance itself. Everything she has is the equipment of an urban guerrilla. She has a target for target practice.
Absolutely,
she has a ditto machine for leaflets. And there are many sexual inversions. Remember, she goes off to war while he stays home.
He stays home.
She has a baby. He rests after pregnancy. So they're typical of kind of carnivalesque technique, there's a lot of sexual inversion.
Okay. Well, he just mentioned the word carnivalesque, and that's one of the things, I mean, I think we would think of, one of the things that people think of when they think of Brazil, one of the few things people may know of it, is Brazil's famous for carnivals themselves. What kind of relationship, say, do you find between a film like this, the carnival tradition, and the carnival tradition in Brazil, and the carnival tradition, or the carnivalesque tradition in literature or film?
Well, actually, as I said before, Macunaima breaks with the tradition of serious films of the Cinema Novo, quotation marks for serious, of course. But it draws from a tradition of Brazilian cinema. Bob mentioned the chanchadas of the 40s and the 50s, the comedies and so on. But the chanchadas themselves, they were an outcome of the carnivalesque films, literally carnivalesque films of the 30s, in which the songs for carnival were performed by Carmen Miranda, among others, in front of the cameras. They were very simple films in terms of narrative and so on. But so the Brazilian audience who goes to watch a film like Macunaima is already prepared by that, because they are familiar with that kind of film.
Right.
So the film is carnivalesque from beginning to end, and it's something very familiar to Brazilians to go to the movie theater and watch a carnival film in itself.
And just one specific example is the use of costume in the film. Now, I think it's interesting that Macunaima had a budget of $100,000, which is extremely low for the kind of rich look.
Right, absolutely.
And a lot of it is done through costumes, and costume is used very symbolically. For example, you remember the first time that Macunaima smokes a magic joint, right? And he turns into a prince.
Right.
The prince is dressed in the cheapest kind of carnival costume, and they say, oh, how beautiful. But there's a whole political allegory occurring. This is another sequence, I think, which was misinterpreted as racist, when in fact it's anti-racist. Because the woman, and I think this is very hard to see in a television presentation, her dress says, Alliance for Progress, donated by the people of the United States. So there's a whole allegory that Macunaima, the hero of his people, wheat flour, the hero of his people is being turned into a prince. Now, what does this refer to? It refers to what was called the Brazilian economic miracle, which basically, after the coup d'etat, there was a lot of collaboration with multinational companies. There was an appearance of a certain wealth on the backs of poor people who got poorer and poorer. So what happens is you see he's turned into a false prince with a kind of tawdry, cheap costume, but it looks like a miracle. In fact, we know he dies in the Amazon, as we know that the Brazilian economic miracle was very short-lived, and now Brazil...
dying in the Amazon.
Exactly. And the Brazil has the largest foreign debt of 160 billion, whatever. So in a way, that's all prophesied in a very allegorical, comic, and carnivalesque mode in this film.
And we should remember, too, that at that time, the military government was commissioning films dealing with historical issues of Brazil, but in the way that they thought it would be taken seriously, for instance, like the independence of the country and the heroes of the country and so on. Those films were never a success.
Right.
But they were shown in theaters, distributed all over, and they were shown on television in special national holidays and things like that. And Macunaima makes fun of all that.
Okay.
So it's very subversive in that moment for a film like Macunaima to be produced, to be made, and to be a success of public.
Well, the other thing about subversiveness, in addition to costumes, is that it covers or it seems to cover all of the indigenous environments of Brazil itself. That is, geographically, while the film may be inexpensive, it has a crazy geography.
Yes,
I mean,
it does.
As the novel is very magical in the sense that in one step, Macunaima will go from Sao Paulo to the extreme north, and Brazil is a huge country.
Right.
So it's a kind of a magical realist novel. The film diminishes that to some extent. But still, as you say, there is this variety of topographies. But if I could elaborate on Zay's point about the subversive side of this film, there's a wonderful outwitting of the censors, and you get attacks on political repression in the film. For example, you remember, first of all, I think perhaps it was difficult to read the subtitles here, and we should comment on it. At one point, there's a man giving a speech which in fact is a very conservative speech. He's talking about warning Brazil against foreign ideologies, right? Macunaima comes up and says, that's not true. He contradicts the man and gets up on top of the statue and makes a speech in which he says the real problems of Brazil, and then he lists a litany of different diseases. And then people start calling him a communist, a subversive. In other words, if you talk about the real problems of Brazil, you'll be called a subversive. He starts running, he's arrested, and Macunaima says, why are you arresting me? I wasn't doing anything. And the man who arrests him, in civilian clothes, interestingly, says, suspicious attitude.
Because
you were running.
You're right.
Right? So already there you see allusions to the whole political repressiveness, and then this kind of parody of patriotic aesthetic, the fact that it uses green and yellow but in very ironic ways. The fact that the opening song you hear is a patriotic anthem about the heroes of Brazil. Yet you see this kind of anti-hero, that this heroic language doesn't really correspond to.
But I think some of the magic remained, not only in terms of his being black and turning white, and then he has a son who is he's himself as black,
Right.
And also things that the Brazilian audiences pick up and maybe a foreign audience wouldn't understand. For instance, who plays Macunaima's mother is the white Macunaima, the same actor himself, So I don't know if you can tell that from the print that's being shown
Which is
here.
again Carnival, the transvestitism,
Yes.
playing different roles. Also, I think the fact that black Macunaima comes back is kind of a joke on the Brazilian proverb that every Brazilian has a foot in the kitchen.
Yes.
The idea is that every Brazilian family has some black African ancestry.
Yeah.
So this denial on racist grounds is very false. The blackness of Brazil always returns.
But that brings us to another sort of aspect of the film. We were chatting about it a little bit before the film began, and that's the whole notion of the tropicalist movement. Now, what is the tropicalist movement? How does this film fit in with it? I mean...
Right. Tropicalism was a movement which started roughly around 1967, which embraced theater. There was a kind of Jerry-esque play, King of the Candle, in 1967, film to a certain extent, music, if people know Gilberto Gil's music. He was a strong tropicalist. And basically the impulse was a rejection of kind of the serious cinema novo, old left pedagogical model where you show people the truth and then they see the truth and they change society. It was against some of the purism of that attitude, which would say the country is less corrupt than the city. What Tropicalism said is that Brazil is a synthesis and the international mass media are here. There's no pure Brazil. Brazil is this mess, and let's affirm it. We can be critical, but that's what we are. There's a whole kind of camp aesthetic, which in Brazil was called cafonice. Pietro's bathtub. Remember, he has a kind of bubble bath. That's kind of a tropicalist reference. At the same time, it's not a complete tropicalist film because in a strange way, it still does have that kind of Cinema Novo political message. I don't know if Zay agrees about this, but I think it's both within and without the movement.
Yes. It's a transition work, definitely.
Okay. Well, then, where does a scene like one of the scenes? Let's get back to some of the things that might be strange in the film, and in some sense,
many things.
many. I mean, there's a lot of that. You know, we have the scenes toward the end at the home, and we have that rather strange swimming pool in which.
Yes.
What is? I mean. It's the swimming pool is a swimming pool, and it's not a swimming pool.
Yeah.
I mean, there's a sort of shifting of things that's going on there.
If you remember, the bourgeois,
Right.
he's the so-called giant.
Right, exactly.
Wenceslao Pietro Pietra. It's also a comment on the Italian bourgeoisie of São Paulo, and I'm Italian Brazilian myself, I can say that. And the Italian bourgeoisie of São Paulo, some of the immigrants, Italian immigrants of the beginning of the century, they became wealthy, and they owned factories and so on. And they were very important in the city in the economic force. And so he is a comment on that kind of bourgeoisie, a kind of tacky bourgeoisie without, a refined education or anything like that. And he is the so-called giant, the man-eater giant, o gigante comedor de gente, the man-eater giant. And that pool is the big party for the wedding of his daughter. Is actually a big feijoada pool. Feijoada is a national dish of Brazilians, It's black bean soup with pork. Only that feijoada was not only huge, but instead of pork, you had people, real people.
Right, yes.
The guests were, picked up their numbers in a kind of lottery, and they were thrown in the black bean soup because the giant family is a man-eating family, of course.
Well, that sort of brings us back to this whole notion of national symbols and to this whole idea of cannibalism, which is something strange and remote to an American bourgeois audience. I mean, it's exotic, etc. But it's a metaphor that's been taken over by the arts in Brazil, as I understand it.
Yes. You see that the giant is a person eating, giant, and that's a metaphor for capitalism and for exploitation, and the giant is a owner, a factory owner, and that's a kind of.
It's interesting that Joaquim Pedro added to the film, and this was actually for the Venice Film Festival. The prints in Brazil do not have this preface about cannibalism, where he basically explains that the modernists in the 20s used cannibalism as a metaphor, basically as an anti-colonial metaphor, saying we, like the Brazilian Indians, should devour the enemy in order to get their strength. In other words, you use European and North American technology, but try not to be dominated by it. And you can see the entire film as, in a way, illustrating all the points made in the preface, because the preface says, the strong eat the weak. We see that the biggest people eater is Pietro Pietra. As an industrialist with second-hand American equipment, he devours people. The poor eat each other. You see an instance of that when Macunaima is robbed. Remember, a man sells him a goose, which supposedly defecates money. Of course, it's a ripoff. Then he runs into a shoeshine boy who has just been robbed. And then he robs what's left that the shoeshine boy has. So you see the poor eating each other within this kind of social cannibalistic environment. The left eats itself through sectarianism. I think that's illustrated in the film when the left blows itself up. Remember, C goes off to war and explodes. And then consumerism is a form of consuming, of devouring, of cannibalism. And you get many references to consumerism, which was part of this economic model. Remember when Macunaima goes back to the Amazon, he has all this bric-a-brac. He has TV sets, he has electric guitar, useless in the jungle.
No electric outlet, of course. To plug that in.
So obviously a point is being made. Even in Pietro Pietra's mansion, you have a tiger. Now, in Brazil at that time, the tiger in your tank of Esso advertising was very popular. So,
and an image much used in Godard, by the way.
Exactly. That's right, La Chinoise and so forth.
Right.
I think we should remark, too, that cannibalism is not necessarily negative.
Well, no, that's a very strong point,
Because culturally, it means our own survival. We have to draw from information from abroad and metabolize ourselves.
Right.
So that's a positive attitude, definitely.
And that's the way in which that also, it as well as being an economic metaphor, an economic model, it's also a kind of cultural
Yes,
model
yes,
and metaphor as,
yes.
As well, and that turns it around into something extremely positive.
And completely anti-xenophobic.
Yeah.
Awesome.
That's of course a very interesting aspect to it, that it's expansive at the same time. It's ingesting something else.
It's kind of an artistic jujitsu,
okay.
right, where you use the power of the enemy against the enemy, but you
Yes.
don't deny that power. That would be naive. And there too, it's the Tropicalist rejection of Cinema Novo, with its attempt to have kind of a pure, authentic Brazil. This is saying, no, there is no pure, authentic Brazil. Brazil is all this mixture, but let's use it in a dynamic and much as in a martial art against those who dominate Brazilian.
Yeah. Now, is there a continuing tradition like this film in Brazilian cinema?
Oh, I would say yes.
Right.
Yeah.
Chica da Silva is a film that was shown in the United States
Yes.
during the 70s by Carlos Diegues. That's a typical example of such,
Right,
films.
carnival reversals. Chica da Silva is about a black woman who was in the richest region of Brazil and became kind of a power behind the throne.
In the
Okay.
18th
Right.
century. Yeah.
And it's a very complicated film, and some people have found it racist in the sense that it, and I think
Again, in Brazil
rightly,
it was taken as
As
anti-racist.
anti-racist.
although there's some debate
well.
about it, right? But there was also a whole avant-garde tradition called Udi Grudi,
Okay.
which is the Brazilian pronunciation of underground.
Underground.
And they were very much in this anthropophagic, modernist, surreal, tropicalist mode.
Yeah.
So it is certainly an ongoing.
Okay, well,
Tradition.
that tradition may be ongoing, but this discussion, at least on the air, can't be, because we've come to
What a shame.
we've come to the end of it. If you'd like more information about Cinema Then, Cinema Now, or about graduate studies or undergraduate studies in cinema, drop us a line. Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Let me give you that information again, okay? Drop it to Cinema Then, Cinema Now, the College of Staten Island, New York, 10301. Well, Bob, thank you for bringing your expertise in things carnivalesque, etc. to the show.
Thank you.
Zay, your equally carnivalesque expertise and things Brazilian. It's a pleasure having
Thank
both
you.
here.
It was our pleasure.
As always, I hope that our discussion here leads you to thought and discussion at home that you enjoy. Thanks for joining us.